The music stopped the moment Eleanor Hartley said the word no. Every candle in the ballroom seemed to hold its breath. 300 guests turned as one, their silk gowns and polished shoes frozen mid-step, their eyes fixed on the tall man standing before her with a small velvet box still open in his hand. Duke Alexander Whitmore did not move. He had never been refused in his entire life, not by a servant, not by a rival, not by fortune itself, and certainly never by a woman he had chosen to marry in front of half the county. Eleanor's voice had not trembled. That was the part that unsettled him most. "I said no, Your Grace," she repeated, quieter this time, though the silence made it sound just as loud. "I will not marry you." Somewhere near the orchestra, a violin string groaned as the musician forgot to breathe properly. Lady Winifred Ashcombe, who had spent the entire evening angling her daughter toward the Duke's attention, pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. Lord Henry Colton, the Duke's closest friend, took one step forward as if to intervene, then thought better of it and stayed where he was, his jaw tight with second-hand embarrassment. Alexander closed the box slowly. He had rehearsed this moment for weeks, had chosen the ring himself from a jeweler in London, had planned the exact words he would say beneath the chandelier where the light would catch her eyes. None of that mattered now. He looked at Eleanor as though seeing her for the first time, though they had known each other since childhood, when their families still spoke and their fathers still rode together on autumn mornings. "May I ask why?" he said. His voice was calm, controlled, the voice he used in Parliament when men twice his age tried to shame him into silence. It did not shake. It would not shake in front of these people. Eleanor lifted her chin. She wore a simple gown of pale green, plain compared to the diamonds and lace surrounding her, and yet she looked more composed than anyone else in the room. "Because you asked me the way a man asks for a horse he intends to purchase," she said. "You listed my virtues as though reading from a ledger. Good family, though reduced in fortune. Well-mannered, presentable. You never once asked what I wanted, Your Grace. You assumed that a title and a fortune were answer enough." A ripple of scandalized whispers moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. Alexander felt heat rise up his collar, not from anger, though anger would have been simpler, but from something closer to shame. He had indeed rehearsed his proposal as a list of reasons. He had believed reasons were what mattered. "You embarrass yourself," muttered his aunt, Lady Cordelia Whitmore, from somewhere behind him, though he barely heard her. "I embarrass no one but myself, madam," Eleanor said, turning briefly toward the older woman, before returning her gaze to Alexander. "I simply will not spend my life as an entry in someone's account book, however grand the account may be." She curtsied then, a perfect, formal curtsy that gave the watching crowd nothing to criticize, and walked from the ballroom without another word. Her mother, pale with horror, hurried after her, whispering apologies to anyone who would listen. The guests began speaking all at once, 100 conversations rising like startled birds, and somewhere in the noise Alexander heard his own name spoken with a kind of pity he had never experienced before. He did not chase after her. A duke did not chase. He stood very still instead, the velvet box now closed in his fist, and told himself that this was simply a woman with more pride than sense. A woman who would regret her foolishness within the week when she understood exactly what she had thrown away. He told himself this while his friend Henry guided him gently toward the terrace doors, away from the staring eyes, out into the cool night air where the stars did not care who had been humiliated and who had not. "That went rather differently than planned," Henry said carefully, once they were alone. Alexander said nothing. He stared out over the dark gardens, past the hedges his father had planted decades before, and found that his mind kept returning to one single detail. It was not her refusal that troubled him. Refusals could be forgotten, dismissed, explained away to interested parties as a woman's temporary confusion. What troubled him was the way she had looked at him while she said it, not with anger, not even with dislike, but with something far more damaging. She had looked at him with disappointment. No one had ever looked at Alexander Whitmore that way before. People admired him, feared him, envied him, and occasionally resented him, but disappointment required a kind of expectation he did not know he had given her reason to hold. It required believing, even briefly, that he was capable of being something more than what he had shown her that night. "I do not understand," he said finally, more to himself than to Henry. "I offered her everything a woman in her position could hope for." Henry leaned against the stone railing, choosing his words with the caution of a man who valued his friendship more than his honesty, and yet decided honesty was owed. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "you offered her everything except yourself." Alexander turned to look at him sharply, but Henry only shrugged, unwilling to elaborate further, and the two men stood in silence while the party continued behind them, bright and glittering and entirely unaware that the most powerful man in the room had just been handed a wound that no physician could treat. Inside the carriage rolling away from the estate, Eleanor sat beside her mother, who had not stopped speaking since they left the ballroom. "Do you understand what you have done?" her mother said, twisting her handkerchief between trembling fingers. "Do you understand what this family has lost tonight, Eleanor? A duke asked for your hand, in front of the entire county, and you refused him as though he were a common tradesman. He treated me like one," Eleanor said quietly, watching the dark fields pass outside the window. "A tradesman offering the best price for goods he wished to acquire." "That is how men of his rank propose marriage," her mother said, exasperated. "Affection comes later, if it comes at all. You cannot expect poetry from a duke, child. You can expect security. You can expect a roof that does not leak, and a table that is never empty." Eleanor did not answer. She knew her mother's fears were not unfounded. Their family's fortune had been shrinking for years, quietly, the way water leaves a cracked vessel, and everyone in their small circle understood that the Hartley name carried more history than money these days. She understood exactly what she had given up by refusing Alexander Whitmore, and she understood, too, that most women in her position would have accepted his offer without a single question about affection or respect. But Eleanor had watched her own parents' marriage, watched her mother smile through years of quiet unhappiness because the arrangement had once seemed sensible on paper, and she had promised herself long ago that she would not repeat that particular mistake, whatever the cost. Still, as the carriage rattled along the dark road toward home, she allowed herself one private thought she would never admit aloud. Alexander Whitmore, for all his coldness that evening, had not been entirely unmoved by her refusal. She had seen it in the brief flicker across his face before he composed himself again, something raw and unguarded that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. She wondered, just for a moment, what kind of man lived beneath that composure, and then she pushed the thought away, because wondering about a duke's private heart was a luxury a woman in her position could not afford. By the time they reached home, a modest house with peeling paint along the window frames and a garden that had once been grand, Eleanor's mother had fallen into exhausted silence. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room alone, removed her pale green gown, and sat by the window for a long while, watching the moon move slowly across the sky. She did not regret her answer. She told herself this firmly, the way one repeats a lesson until it becomes true. She did not regret it, though she suspected the coming weeks would test that conviction in ways she could not yet imagine, and though somewhere across the fields, in a grand house with too many empty rooms, a duke sat awake as well, staring at nothing, unable to understand why a single word from an unremarkable woman had unsettled him more than any battle he had ever fought in Parliament or in life. Neither of them slept well that night. Neither of them would admit it to another living soul. 3 weeks passed, and the county had not stopped talking about the ballroom at Whitmore Hall. Eleanor heard the whispers everywhere she went, in the milliner's shop, at church, even from the boy who delivered coal to their door. A woman refusing a duke was rare enough to become legend, and legends grew crueler with every retelling. By the 3rd week, the story had transformed from a simple refusal into a tale of a foolish girl who had insulted the finest family in the region out of pure vanity, and no correction Eleanor offered seemed to slow its spread. Her mother had stopped attending social calls entirely, claiming headaches that everyone understood were something closer to grief. Her younger brother Thomas, no longer Reed but simply Thomas Hartley, had been teased at his school about his sister's audacity, though he defended her fiercely whenever the subject arose, which only made matters worse among boys who enjoyed watching him grow red with anger. Eleanor bore the whispers with as much dignity as she could manage, though some nights, alone in her room, she allowed herself to wonder whether she had been foolish after all. Pride, she reminded herself, did not pay for coal in winter. That reminder became more urgent one gray morning when her father called her into his study, his face drawn in a way she had rarely seen before. "Eleanor," he said, gesturing for her to sit, "I must speak plainly with you, and I ask that you listen without argument, at least until I have finished." She sat, folding her hands in her lap, bracing herself. "Our finances," he continued, choosing each word with visible difficulty, "are worse than I have allowed your mother or you to understand. The harvest failed twice these last years, and certain investments I made in good faith did not return what was promised. I do not say this to frighten you, but because I believe you deserve honesty, given what has happened." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. "How bad is it, father?" Bad enough, he admitted, that I have begun to consider whether your brother's schooling can continue past this year. Bad enough that I fear for what will happen to this house if matters do not improve within the 12-month. The silence that followed felt heavier than any that had filled the ballroom weeks before. I am not asking you to regret your decision regarding the Duke, her father added quickly, seeing the color drain from her face. That choice was yours to make, and I respect it, even where your mother does not. But I must ask whether you would consider other means of contributing to this household, at least until our circumstances improve. Eleanor understood immediately what he meant, and to her own surprise, she felt relief rather than shame. A solution, however humble, was better than helplessness. I could seek a position, she said, as a governess perhaps, or a companion to some elderly lady of good family. I have education enough for either. Her father's shoulders eased slightly, though guilt still lined his face. I had hoped you would suggest it yourself. I did not wish to ask it of you directly. You did not ask, father. I offered. She reached across the desk and squeezed his hand, feeling the tremor in his fingers, the tremor of a proud man forced to admit weakness to his own child. We will manage this together. Word of available governess positions traveled quickly through their small social circle, mostly through Mrs. Caldwell, a family friend who knew every household within 20 miles, and their private business besides. Within a fortnight, Mrs. Caldwell arrived at their door with news that made Eleanor's stomach drop in a way she had not expected. Lord Edward Whitmore, Mrs. Caldwell announced, settling into the parlor chair with the satisfaction of a woman delivering excellent gossip, is in need of a governess for his young daughter, little Grace. The child is bright but has driven away 2 governesses already this year alone, poor thing, missing her mother terribly since the fever took her. Lord Edward is the Duke's cousin, you understand, and his estate borders the Duke's own land quite closely. Eleanor's cup rattled slightly against its saucer. Lord Edward Whitmore, she repeated carefully. The very same family, my dear, though a different branch entirely. And Lord Edward himself is a perfectly amiable gentleman, nothing like his cousin in temperament, from what I understand. Very informal household. You would hardly cross paths with the Duke at all, I should think, given how rarely he visits his cousin's estate. Eleanor should have refused immediately. Every instinct told her that placing herself so near Alexander Whitmore's family, so soon after humiliating him in front of the entire county, invited nothing but further complication. And yet the position offered a generous wage, comfortable lodgings, and proximity to home that other opportunities did not, and her family's circumstances did not allow the luxury of avoiding awkward situations for the sake of pride. She accepted the position within the week. Her first days at Ashwood Manor, Lord Edward's estate, passed quietly enough. Grace, a solemn child of 7 with dark curls and her late mother's eyes, tested Eleanor's patience in small ways at first, refusing lessons, hiding books, declaring loudly that she hated arithmetic and history, and anything requiring her to sit still for longer than a quarter hour. But Eleanor had grown up with a younger brother of considerable stubbornness herself, and she recognized in Grace, not defiance, but grief, wearing the mask of misbehavior. You miss your mother, Eleanor said gently, on the 4th afternoon, after Grace had thrown her slate across the schoolroom in frustration over a simple sum. Grace's small face crumpled, and for a moment, Eleanor feared she had said entirely the wrong thing. But then the child nodded, tears spilling freely, and allowed herself to be pulled into an embrace that had nothing to do with lessons at all. From that afternoon forward, something shifted between them. Grace still tested boundaries as children do, but she began seeking Eleanor out during quiet hours, asking questions about her mother's favorite flowers, or whether Eleanor believed people watched over their families from somewhere beyond the sky. Eleanor answered honestly whenever she could, and gently redirected when honesty felt too heavy for a child's shoulders to carry. Lord Edward, watching this transformation from a respectful distance, expressed his gratitude one evening as Eleanor prepared to retire for the night. I confess I did not expect such progress so quickly, he said, standing in the doorway of the small parlor she used for evening reading. He was a mild man, fair-haired and soft-spoken, entirely unlike the image Eleanor had carried of the Whitmore family since that terrible night in the ballroom. The previous governesses found her impossible. She is not impossible, Eleanor said. She is grieving, and grief looks like impossibility to those who have not learned to see past it. Lord Edward studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing his face. You speak with unusual understanding, Miss Hartley, for someone so young. Eleanor merely smiled and said nothing further, unwilling to explain that grief of a different kind. The grief of watching one's family struggle while pride demanded silence had taught her more about patience than any book ever could. It was nearly 3 weeks into her position, on a bright autumn afternoon, when Grace had insisted on taking their lessons outdoors beneath the old oak near the eastern gate, that Eleanor heard the sound of approaching horses and felt her entire body go still with recognition, before she even turned to look. "Uncle Alexander!" Grace shrieked with delight, abandoning her slate entirely and racing across the grass toward the mounted figures approaching the gate. Eleanor rose slowly, smoothing her plain gray dress with hands that had suddenly gone unsteady, and watched as Duke Alexander Whitmore dismounted his horse with the same effortless composure she remembered from the ballroom, though something in his posture seemed different now, less rigid perhaps, or simply less prepared for what awaited him on the other side of that gate. He caught sight of her before Grace had even finished her enthusiastic greeting, and for one long moment, neither of them spoke. The autumn wind stirred the leaves around them, golden and red, falling slowly onto the grass where Grace's abandoned slate still lay, and Eleanor found herself unable to look away from the expression crossing Alexander's face, an expression that held far more than simple surprise. "Miss Hartley," he said finally, his voice carefully even, though something beneath the surface suggested the effort it cost him to keep it that way. "I was not aware you had taken a position in my cousin's household. Nor was I aware, Your Grace, that you visited this estate with any frequency," Eleanor replied, matching his composure with her own, though her heart beat far too quickly beneath her calm exterior. "Mrs. Caldwell assured me our paths would rarely cross." "Mrs. Caldwell," Alexander said, something almost like amusement flickering across his features for the first time since his arrival, "has evidently overestimated my ability to stay away from my only cousin's household." Grace, oblivious to the tension crackling between the two adults, tugged eagerly at her uncle's sleeve, chattering about the sums she had learned and the story Eleanor had read her the previous evening about a shipwrecked sailor finding his way home. Alexander allowed himself to be led toward the blanket spread beneath the oak tree, though his eyes returned repeatedly to Eleanor, who busied herself gathering scattered books with far more concentration than the task actually required. Lord Edward emerged from the house moments later, greeting his cousin warmly, entirely unaware of the history binding his governess and his most powerful relative together, and the afternoon that followed unfolded with a strange, careful politeness that fooled everyone present except the two people who understood exactly how much weight lay beneath every ordinary word they exchanged. Eleanor told herself, as she walked back to her small room that evening, that this had been a single unfortunate encounter, unlikely to repeat itself with any regularity. She told herself this while lying awake far longer than usual, replaying the brief, unguarded moment when Alexander had looked at her across the autumn grass, and wondering why disappointment no longer seemed to be the only expression she could read in his eyes. She would soon discover, entirely mistaken about how rarely their paths would cross from that day forward. The rain had not stopped for 2 days when Lord Edward fell ill, and it was that illness, more than any deliberate scheme, that drew Alexander back to Ashwood Manor with a frequency neither he nor Eleanor had anticipated. A fever had settled into Lord Edward's chest, the physician explained gravely, the kind that required watching, the kind that could turn dangerous in a man not yet fully recovered from the grief of losing his wife the previous year. Alexander, as the only close family remaining, took it upon himself to visit daily, checking on his cousin's condition, managing the estate's affairs in his absence, and inevitably, spending time with young Grace, who grew frightened watching her father confined to his bed. It fell to Eleanor to keep the child occupied during those anxious days, and it fell to Alexander, more often than either of them planned, to join her in that effort. "She asked me this morning whether Papa would die the way Mama did," Alexander said quietly, one gray afternoon, as they walked together along the covered gallery while Grace napped upstairs, exhausted from a morning of forced cheerfulness that had clearly cost her more than she let show. I did not know what to tell her. "You told her the truth, I hope," Eleanor said. "Children sense evasion more quickly than we credit them for. I told her that her father was strong, and that the physician believed he would recover, and that whatever happened, she would never be alone, because I would always be there." Alexander's voice carried an unusual roughness. "I am not certain that was the correct answer." "It was an honest one," Eleanor said gently. "That is often enough." They walked in silence for a while, their footsteps echoing softly against the stone floor of the gallery, rain drumming steadily against the tall windows beside them. Eleanor found herself stealing glances at him, at the tired lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent worrying over his cousin's health, at the way his usual rigid composure had softened into something far more human than the man she had refused in that glittering ballroom weeks before. "May I ask you something, Miss Hartley?" Alexander said finally, stopping beside one of the tall windows. "And trust that you will answer honestly." as you seem inclined to do regardless of whether the truth is comfortable. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken but nodded. That night, at the ball, you said I asked for your hand as though purchasing a horse. He turned to face her fully now, his gray eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her want to look away, and yet held her fixed in place. I have thought of little else since. I wish to understand what you meant, precisely. Eleanor considered her words carefully, aware that honesty here carried real weight, not the abstract weight of a ballroom audience but the specific weight of the man standing directly before her. You listed reasons, Your Grace. My family's history, my manners, my suitability. You spoke of me as one speaks of a property under consideration, weighing its merits against its cost. You never once asked what I hoped for in a husband, nor did you offer anything of yourself beyond your title and your fortune. I could not marry a man who saw marriage as a transaction, however advantageous the terms. Alexander absorbed this in silence, his jaw working slightly as though tasting something unpleasant and true. I was raised, he said eventually, to believe that marriage among families such as mine was precisely that. A transaction. My own parents' union was arranged before either of them had reached 20 years of age, based entirely on land and lineage, and they managed a perfectly civil, perfectly cold partnership for 30 years until my mother's death. I assumed this was simply how such matters were conducted. And is that the kind of marriage you wish for yourself? Eleanor asked quietly. The question seemed to catch him entirely off guard. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens as though the answer might be found somewhere among the drenched hedges. I do not know, he admitted finally, and something in the admission seemed to cost him greatly, as though he had never allowed himself to ask the question before that moment. I had not considered that another kind of marriage might be possible for someone in my position. It is possible, Eleanor said softly. I have seen it, in humbler households than yours. My own parents, whatever their struggles, chose each other freely, and though our fortunes have suffered, I have never doubted the affection between them. It is not wealth that determines whether a marriage brings happiness, Your Grace. It is whether both people involved are truly seen by the other. Alexander turned back to look at her then, and something in his expression made Eleanor's breath catch unexpectedly. I find, he said slowly, that I am beginning to see you rather clearly, Miss Hartley, though I confess the sight is somewhat unsettling to a man who prided himself on never being surprised by anything. Eleanor did not know how to respond to that, and so she said nothing at all, though the silence between them felt charged with something neither of them was yet prepared to name. Their conversations continued in this manner over the following weeks, snatched between duties, exchanged in quiet corners of the estate, while Lord Edward slowly recovered his strength, and Grace grew increasingly attached to both the governess who had brought comfort into her frightened days, and the uncle who had proven, against all her earlier assumptions, capable of genuine tenderness. Eleanor began to see facets of Alexander that the ballroom had never revealed. She watched him kneel patiently in the mud to help Grace search for a lost kitten, ruining an expensive coat without a single word of complaint. She watched him sit beside his cousin's sickbed late into the evening, reading aloud from books neither of them particularly enjoyed, simply because the sound of a familiar voice seemed to ease Lord Edward's restless sleep. She watched him listen, truly listen, when the estate's elderly steward described difficulties with the autumn harvest, offering practical solutions rather than dismissive commands. He was not, she began to understand, the cold and calculating man his reputation suggested. He was a man who had been taught from childhood that vulnerability was weakness, that affection was a luxury unavailable to someone burdened with a dukedom's responsibilities, and who was only now, slowly and painfully, beginning to question whether that lesson had been correct. For his part, Alexander found himself drawn to Eleanor in ways that unsettled his careful sense of order. She challenged him constantly, questioning his assumptions with a directness no one else dared employ, and yet her challenges never felt like attacks. They felt like invitations, as though she believed him capable of becoming something better than what he currently was, and that belief, quiet and unspoken though it remained, affected him more deeply than any flattery he had received throughout his privileged life. One evening, as autumn began giving way to the first sharp bite of winter, Alexander found Eleanor alone in the library, curled into a window seat with a worn book of poetry balanced on her knees, the last light of sunset catching the loose strands of hair that had escaped her usual careful arrangement. He stood in the doorway for a long moment simply watching her, unwilling to disturb whatever peace she had found in that quiet corner, until she glanced up and caught him there. Your Grace, she said, straightening slightly, though she did not close the book. I did not hear you approach. Please, he said, stepping into the room. Do not let me interrupt. I was merely passing. You have been merely passing this library rather frequently these last weeks, Eleanor observed, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth that made his chest tighten in a way he did not fully understand. Perhaps I find the company here preferable to elsewhere in the house, he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of the statement. Eleanor's smile deepened slightly, though she quickly returned her attention to her book, as though needing somewhere else to direct her gaze. Your cousin's library is quite excellent, she said, though I suspect that is not entirely what you mean. Alexander crossed the room and settled into the chair opposite her window seat, close enough that the fading light illuminated them both, close enough that he could see the faint flush rising in her cheeks despite her composed expression. You know precisely what I mean, Miss Hartley, he said quietly. I believe you have known for some weeks now, just as I have. Eleanor's hands stilled on the pages of her book. Your Grace, she began carefully, I refused your proposal for reasons I still believe were sound. I do not wish for either of us to forget that fact simply because circumstance has thrown us together with unexpected frequency. I have not forgotten, Alexander said. I think of little else, in truth, but I wonder whether the man who proposed to you that evening was entirely the same man sitting before you now. I have learned a great deal these past weeks, Miss Hartley, about what I want and what I lack and what I might become if given the proper reason to try. Eleanor's breath caught, and for a long moment, the only sound in the library was the soft crackle of the fire and the distant rain against the windows. And what reason would that be, Your Grace? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander held her gaze steadily, something raw and unguarded finally breaking through the careful composure he had maintained for so many years. You, he said simply. You are the reason, Eleanor, though I understand fully that I have not yet earned the right to say so, and that earning it may take considerably longer than either of us would prefer. The use of her given name, spoken so quietly and so deliberately, sent a shiver through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the winter chill creeping through the old library windows. She did not answer immediately, uncertain what answer she could possibly give, that would not either promise too much or deny what she was beginning to feel far too strongly to continue denying. I cannot give you an answer tonight, she said finally, closing her book with careful, deliberate movements. There is too much still unresolved between us, too much history that cannot simply be erased by weeks of pleasant conversation in your cousin's library. I am not asking for an answer tonight, Alexander said, rising to his feet, though he lingered near her chair a moment longer than necessary. I am simply telling you the truth, Eleanor, because I believe you deserve truth from me, whatever you eventually decide to do with it. He left the library then, his footsteps fading down the corridor, and Eleanor remained by the window long after the last light had faded entirely from the sky, her heart caught somewhere between the caution that had guided her every decision since that terrible night in the ballroom, and a hope she had not permitted herself to feel in a very long time. Neither of them could have known, on that quiet winter evening, how quickly and how cruelly the fragile trust growing between them was about to be tested. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday evening, Eleanor's name had been ruined in every drawing room within 20 miles. She learned of its contents from Mrs. Caldwell, who arrived at Ashwood Manor breathless and pale, clutching a folded paper as though it might burn her fingers. You must see this, my dear, she said, pressing the letter into Eleanor's hands with trembling urgency. It is circulating everywhere. I came as quickly as I could, before you heard it from someone crueler than myself. Eleanor unfolded the paper with a growing sense of dread, and read words that made her stomach twist violently. The letter, written in an elegant hand and signed only with initials that meant nothing to her, claimed that Eleanor Hartley had engaged in an improper relationship with Duke Alexander Whitmore during her employment in his cousin's household, that she had refused his initial proposal only as a calculated scheme to secure a more scandalous arrangement, and that decent families throughout the county should consider carefully before allowing their daughters near her influence. This is entirely false, Eleanor said, her hands shaking so badly the paper rustled audibly. Nothing improper has occurred between myself and the Duke. We have spoken, yes, but always with complete propriety, always within sight of others in this household. I believe you, my dear, Mrs. Caldwell said gently, though worry lined her kind face. But belief and reputation are very different matters in circles such as ours. This letter has been copied and shared among a dozen households already. By week's end, every family in the county will have heard some version of these accusations. Eleanor sank into the nearest chair, the letter still clutched in her trembling hands. Who would write such a thing? Who would wish to harm me so deliberately? It did not take long to discover the answer. Within 2 days, whispers had traced the letter's origin to Lady Constance Ashford, a widow of considerable influence whose daughter, Charlotte, had spent the past 2 seasons pursuing Alexander's attention with singular determination, encouraged at every turn by her ambitious mother. When rumors reached Lady Constance that the Duke had been spending considerable time at his cousin's estate, in close company with the very governess who had publicly humiliated him months before, her fury had apparently found expression in the most damaging way available to her. Alexander arrived at Ashwood Manor the moment word reached him, his face carrying an expression Eleanor had never seen before, something dark and controlled that suggested restraint costing him considerable effort. "I have already spoken with my solicitor," he said, finding Eleanor in the small parlor where she had retreated from Lord Edward's questioning glances and Grace's innocent confusion about why everyone seemed so upset. "The letter constitutes clear defamation. Lady Constance will face serious consequences for what she has done." "Consequences will not undo what has already spread through every household in this county," Eleanor said quietly, staring at her folded hands. "My reputation, whatever remained of it after the ballroom, is now entirely destroyed. No respectable family will hire me. My own presence in society will be considered a scandal wherever I go." "Then I will make it publicly known that the accusations are false," Alexander said firmly. "I will state clearly, before whatever audience is necessary, that nothing improper has occurred, that you have behaved with nothing but propriety throughout your time in my cousin's household. And will that not simply confirm, in the minds of those already inclined to believe the worst, that there is truth in the rumors requiring such a firm denial?" Eleanor looked up at him, exhaustion and fear evident in her eyes despite her attempt at composure. "Your Grace, I appreciate your intention, but I fear any public statement from you will only draw more attention to the scandal, rather than extinguish it. Society enjoys nothing more than a story it believes has been confirmed by the very denial meant to disprove it." Alexander crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, an act so far beneath his usual dignity that Eleanor stared at him in genuine surprise. "Then tell me what you wish me to do," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I will not stand aside and allow your name to be destroyed for something that never occurred, simply because propriety suggests silence is the safer course. I have spent my entire life choosing the safer course, Eleanor, and I find I have no interest in doing so any longer, not where you are concerned." Eleanor felt tears threatening, despite her best effort to remain composed. "You risk your own standing by defending me publicly," she said. "Lady Constance holds considerable influence. Opposing her openly will make enemies among families whose good opinion matters to your position." "Let them be my enemies," Alexander said simply. "I have weighed a great many things throughout my life against the approval of society, and I find, increasingly, that such approval matters far less than I once believed." The following evening, at a gathering hosted by the county's most prominent family, precisely the sort of event where Lady Constance's whispered accusations had gained the most traction, Alexander made good on his promise in a manner that shocked every guest present. He arrived not with careful diplomatic language designed to smooth over scandal without confronting it directly, but with a direct and public statement delivered before the assembled crowd, describing exactly how the rumors had originated, naming Lady Constance's daughter's failed pursuit of his attention as the true source of the malicious letter, and stating in clear terms that Eleanor Hartley had conducted herself throughout their acquaintance with nothing but complete integrity. Lady Constance, caught entirely off guard by such a direct confrontation, attempted several flustered denials before ultimately fleeing the gathering in humiliation, her daughter Charlotte trailing behind her with tears streaming down her powdered face. The assembled guests, who had arrived expecting an evening of delicious gossip about Eleanor's supposed scandal, instead witnessed the complete unraveling of Lady Constance's reputation as a woman capable of considerable cruelty when her ambitions were thwarted. News of the confrontation spread through the county even faster than the original rumors had, and within a week, public opinion had shifted dramatically. Some families remained cautious, unwilling to fully abandon their suspicions regardless of the Duke's passionate defense, but many others, particularly those who had never held Lady Constance in particularly high regard, began speaking of Eleanor with newfound respect, admiring the quiet dignity with which she had endured such public scrutiny. Eleanor learned of the confrontation the following morning, when Mrs. Caldwell arrived once again, though this time her expression carried excitement rather than dread. "He defended you before the entire assembly," Mrs. Caldwell said, practically breathless with the retelling. "Named Lady Constance directly as the source of the letter, spoke of your integrity in terms I have rarely heard a man of his rank use regarding any woman, let alone one he had once been publicly refused by. My dear, The entire county is speaking of nothing else. Eleanor sat very still, absorbing this information with a strange mixture of relief and something far more complicated stirring beneath it. Alexander had risked considerable social capital defending her, had confronted a woman of significant influence directly and publicly, had chosen her reputation over his own comfortable neutrality, and he had done so without waiting for any answer to the confession he had made in his cousin's library weeks before. She found him later that afternoon in the gardens, walking alone along the frost-covered paths, his breath visible in the cold winter air. "You did not need to do what you did," she said, approaching slowly, her boots crunching against the frozen grass. "I did need to," Alexander said, turning to face her. "I could not stand by while your name was destroyed for something that never happened. Whatever else remains uncertain between us, Eleanor, that much was never in question." Eleanor stopped a few feet away from him, studying his face in the pale winter light, seeing in his expression none of the cold composure that had once defined every interaction she witnessed from him. "I do not know how to thank you properly," she said softly. "You have given up something significant on my behalf, and I have given you nothing in return." "You have given me a great deal already," Alexander said quietly, closing the distance between them, until only inches separated their frost-touched breath. "You have shown me what it means to be seen honestly, to be challenged rather than simply agreed with, to consider that perhaps the life I was raised to expect is not the only life available to me. I did not defend you tonight expecting anything in return, Eleanor. I defended you because it was right, and because I could not have lived with myself had I chosen silence instead." Eleanor felt the last of her careful defenses beginning to crumble. Though caution still whispered warnings she could not entirely silence. "There is still much unresolved," she said. "My family's circumstances, the difference in our stations, the entire weight of a society that will never fully accept a duke choosing a woman such as myself, whatever admiration this particular incident may have earned me. I am aware of every obstacle you name," Alexander said. "And I find that none of them matter to me nearly as much as they once might have. I am not asking for your answer today, Eleanor. I am simply asking that you allow me to continue proving, through action rather than empty words, that I am capable of being the kind of man worthy of your consideration." Eleanor did not answer immediately, though something in her chest, long guarded against exactly this kind of vulnerability, began to soften in ways she had not expected, and was not entirely certain how to resist any longer. Neither of them could have known that even as this fragile trust deepened between them, a far more personal storm was gathering within Eleanor's own family, one that would test everything they had begun to build together, in ways neither scandal nor rumor ever could. Winter had fully settled over the county by the time Eleanor noticed the change in her father's behavior, a quiet unease she initially mistook for the ordinary strain of the season's expenses. He had grown thinner, she realized during a visit home in early December, his face drawn in ways that spoke of sleepless nights, and he flinched noticeably whenever a letter arrived bearing an unfamiliar seal. Her mother, too, seemed burdened by some private worry she refused to discuss, offering only vague reassurances whenever Eleanor pressed for explanation. The truth emerged on a bitter evening when a stranger arrived at the Hartley household demanding to speak with her father directly, his manner brusque and his tone carrying the particular coldness of a man accustomed to collecting debts. Eleanor, home for a brief visit from Ashwood Manor, listened through the thin walls of the parlor as her father's voice cracked with a desperation she had never heard from him before, pleading for additional time, explaining circumstances beyond his control, while the stranger's responses grew increasingly threatening in tone. When the visitor finally departed, Eleanor found her father slumped in his study chair, his face buried in his hands, and she knew immediately that whatever secret he had been carrying could no longer remain hidden. "Father," she said gently, closing the door behind her, "you must tell me what is happening. I cannot help you if you continue to carry this burden alone." It took considerable coaxing before Edmund Hartley finally confessed the full truth, a truth that had apparently been building for years beneath the surface of their already struggling household. Years earlier, desperate to save the family from an even earlier financial crisis, he had borrowed a significant sum from a man of questionable reputation, a debt he had believed manageable at the time, but which had grown substantially through compounding interest, and his own inability to make consistent payments during the harvest failures that followed. "I did not wish for either you or your mother to know the full extent of it," he admitted, his voice hollow with shame. "I hoped I could resolve the matter quietly, through additional investments, through careful management. But the debt has grown beyond anything I can reasonably repay, and the man to whom I owe this sum has grown impatient. He threatens to expose the matter publicly, to ruin what remains of our family's reputation, unless payment arrives within the month. Eleanor felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet. How much, father? The sum he named made her breath catch painfully in her chest. It was a fortune far beyond anything their family could hope to raise, even if they sold every possession they owned, even if she surrendered every coin of her modest governess wages for years to come. I did not want this burden to touch you, her father said, tears finally spilling down his weathered face. Especially not now, not when you have finally found some measure of happiness with the Duke's attentions, whatever complications that particular situation carries with it. I feared that if this debt became known, it would destroy any possibility you might have for a respectable future, whether with him or with anyone else. Eleanor sat with him long into the night, her mind racing through possibilities, none of which offered any genuine solution. She thought of Alexander, of the growing trust between them, of everything he had already risked defending her reputation against Lady Constance's cruel accusations, and she felt a fresh wave of shame at the thought of what he might think, learning that her family concealed such significant debt beneath their already reduced circumstances. She did not tell him immediately. For several days, she carried the secret alone, distracted and withdrawn during her hours with Grace, distant during the brief encounters she shared with Alexander around the estate, until he finally confronted her directly one evening in the library that had become, over recent months, something of a private sanctuary between them. Something troubles you, Alexander said, setting aside the book he had been pretending to read, his eyes studying her with obvious concern. You have been distant these past days, Eleanor, and I find I cannot simply ignore it any longer. Eleanor considered lying, considered offering some vague excuse about family matters that required no further explanation, but the memory of everything Alexander had already sacrificed on her behalf made deception feel like a betrayal she could not bring herself to commit. My family carries a significant debt, she said finally, the words spilling out in a rush once she finally allowed herself to begin. My father borrowed considerable sums years ago, hoping to save us from an earlier crisis, and the debt has grown far beyond his ability to repay. The man he owes threatens to expose the matter publicly unless payment arrives within weeks, and I fear the exposure will destroy whatever remains of my family's standing, and by extension, whatever standing I have managed to preserve for myself despite everything that has already occurred this season. She braced herself for disappointment, for the careful withdrawal she half expected from a man of his position, upon learning that the woman he had defended so publicly carried such significant financial shame within her own family. Instead, Alexander's expression carried nothing but steady concern. How much is owed? He asked simply. Eleanor named the sum, watching his face carefully for any flicker of the calculation she feared, any sign that he was weighing the cost of continued association against his growing affection for her. She saw nothing of the sort. I can settle this matter within the week, he said, as though discussing something as ordinary as arranging transportation for a journey. I did not tell you this seeking your assistance, Eleanor said quickly, alarm rising in her chest. I told you because I could not continue deceiving you through silence, not because I expected you to solve a problem that is entirely my family's burden to bear. I will not have you believe that my honesty was some manner of request for financial rescue. I do not believe that at all, Alexander said gently. I believe you told me because you trust me, which is a gift I do not take lightly given everything that stands between your family's circumstances and mine. But Eleanor, I have resources sufficient to resolve this matter without any significant strain to my own affairs, and I find that I want to help your family, not as some transaction meant to secure your favor, but because your father's shame need not become your burden to carry alone. I cannot accept such generosity, Eleanor said, though her voice wavered with the effort of maintaining her resolve. It would place my family entirely in your debt, and I have spent too many months trying to preserve some measure of independence to surrender it so completely now. Alexander rose and crossed the room, taking her hands gently in his own. Then let it not be a debt owed to me, he said. Let it be a gift, freely given, expecting nothing whatsoever in return. Not even your continued regard should you decide, after all of this, that your feelings for me remain uncertain. I will resolve this matter quietly, through channels that will not expose your father's shame to public scrutiny, and I will do so regardless of whatever you ultimately decide regarding my own hopes for our future together. Eleanor searched his face for any hint of manipulation, any suggestion that this generosity carried hidden expectation, and found nothing but genuine sincerity in his steady gaze. Why would you do this? She whispered, expecting nothing in return. Because I love you, Alexander said simply, the words falling into the quiet library with a weight that seemed to still the very air around them. I believe I have loved you since that terrible evening in the ballroom, though I did not understand it then, mistaking the sting of your refusal for wounded pride, rather than recognizing it for what it truly was, the first honest moment anyone had ever offered me. I love you, Eleanor, and I will help your family because their well-being matters to me, precisely because your well-being matters to me, entirely apart from whatever answer you eventually give regarding my own hopes. Eleanor felt tears finally spill down her cheeks, months of accumulated fear and pride and careful self-protection finally breaking beneath the weight of his sincerity. I do not know how to trust so completely, she admitted. I have spent so long guarding myself against exactly this kind of vulnerability. Then trust slowly, Alexander said softly, reaching up to brush the tears from her face with gentle fingers. I am not asking you to abandon every caution overnight. I am simply asking you to allow me the chance to continue earning whatever trust you can offer, one honest moment at a time. True to his word, Alexander resolved her father's debt within the week, arranging the matter through his own solicitor with such discretion that no whisper of the original crisis ever reached the county's eager gossips. Edmund Hartley wept with relief and gratitude when Eleanor finally explained what had been done on his behalf, though his relief carried an undercurrent of guilt at the thought of his daughter's suitor bearing such a significant burden without any promise of reward. He asked for nothing in return, father, Eleanor assured him, though even as she spoke the words, she felt her own heart shifting toward a certainty she had resisted for months. He did this because he cares for our family's well-being, entirely apart from whatever I ultimately decide regarding his affections. Her father studied her carefully, something knowing crossing his tired face. And what have you decided, Eleanor? I have watched you these past months, and I have never seen you speak of any man the way you speak of the Duke, not even in careful denial. Eleanor did not answer immediately, though the answer, she realized with sudden clarity, had been forming within her for weeks now, ever since that quiet evening in the library when Alexander had first admitted the truth of his changing heart. She knew what she wanted to say. She simply needed to find the courage to say it directly to the man who had earned, through patience and honesty and genuine sacrifice, exactly the kind of trust she had once believed impossible to offer anyone wearing a title as grand as his. Snow had begun falling over Ashwood Manor by the time Eleanor made her decision, soft white flakes drifting past the library windows where so much of their story together had quietly unfolded over the preceding months. She found Alexander in the stables that morning, checking on his horse before what he had told Grace would be his final visit before the roads grew too dangerous for regular travel through winter. He looked up as she entered, snow still dusting her dark cloak, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold, and something in her expression made him set aside the brush he had been using and turn to face her fully. Eleanor, he said, his breath visible in the cold stable air, I did not expect you this morning. I could not let you leave without speaking to you first, she said, her voice steady despite the nervousness fluttering in her chest. I have thought of little else these past days, Alexander, turning over everything that has happened between us since that terrible evening at your ball. Alexander waited, his expression carefully guarded against hope he had learned, through months of patient waiting, not to assume too quickly. I refused you that night because I feared becoming an entry in someone's ledger, Eleanor continued, a convenient arrangement built on suitability rather than genuine understanding. I feared spending my life beside a man who saw me as a title's necessary accessory rather than a person worthy of being truly known. I do not fear that any longer, Alexander. You have shown me, through months of quiet actions rather than grand declarations, exactly the kind of man you are capable of becoming, and I find that man is one I wish to know for the rest of my life. Alexander crossed the stable floor in 3 quick strides, closing the distance between them entirely, his hands finding hers with a gentleness that belied the urgency evident in every line of his posture. Are you saying, he said, his voice rough with barely contained emotion, that you would consider, this time, accepting what I once offered so poorly? I am saying, Eleanor replied, a smile breaking through her careful composure, that I love you, Alexander Whitmore, not the Duke, not the title, not the fortune that could have solved my family's troubles from the very beginning, had I chosen differently that first evening. I love the man who knelt in the mud for a lost kitten, who read aloud through sleepless nights to comfort his frightened cousin, who defended my reputation before an entire assembly, without waiting for any promise of reward, who resolved my father's debt, expecting absolutely nothing in return, except the chance to keep proving himself worthy of my trust. That man I would be honored to marry, if he still wishes to ask me properly this time. Alexander laughed, a sound of pure joy that Eleanor had never heard from him before. warm and unguarded in a way his careful public composure had never permitted. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, the very same box, Eleanor realized with a rush of tender recognition, that he had carried on that terrible evening months before. "I have carried this with me every day since that ball," he admitted, opening the box to reveal the same ring he had once offered so poorly. "I could not bring myself to return it, though I told myself repeatedly that I had moved beyond hoping for a different answer. I understand now why you refused me that night, Eleanor, and I promise you that whatever I ask you today, I ask not as a duke seeking a suitable wife, but as a man who loves you completely, who wishes to know your thoughts and your fears and your joys for every day remaining in his life, whatever fortune or misfortune that life might bring us." He knelt then, right there in the modest stable with the smell of hay and horses surrounding them, snow still falling softly beyond the open door, and asked her properly this time, with none of the rehearsed language of his first attempt, simply the honest and trembling words of a man laying his heart before the one person who had taught him what genuine vulnerability truly meant. Eleanor said yes before he had even finished speaking, pulling him to his feet and into an embrace that held none of the careful propriety expected of their respective stations, only the pure relief and joy of two people who had found, against considerable odds, exactly the kind of understanding neither had believed possible when their story first began. News of their engagement spread through the county within days, and this time, the whispers carried none of the scandal or cruelty that had accompanied their earlier history together. Even those who had once doubted Eleanor's intentions found themselves charmed by the obvious devotion evident whenever the couple appeared together, Alexander's careful attention to her opinions, Eleanor's steady influence softening the Duke's once formidable reserve into something far warmer and more approachable than the county had ever witnessed from him before. Lady Constance Ashford, humiliated beyond recovery by her earlier scheme, withdrew from society entirely for the season, her daughter Charlotte eventually finding happiness with a gentleman of more modest means who valued her company without regard for connections to grander families. Their story, while less dramatic than Eleanor and Alexander's, offered its own quiet resolution, a reminder that ambition pursued without genuine affection rarely brought the satisfaction its pursuers imagined. Grace, delighted beyond measure at the prospect of gaining Eleanor permanently as family rather than merely as governess, insisted on selecting flowers for the wedding herself, and Lord Edward, fully recovered from his earlier illness, watched the preparations with the quiet satisfaction of a man grateful to see both his cousin and his daughter's beloved teacher find happiness they each deserved. The wedding took place in early spring, beneath the same ancient oak tree where Alexander had first discovered Eleanor teaching Grace her lessons months before, surrounded by close family and the handful of friends who had supported them through every difficulty their unlikely courtship had encountered. Eleanor wore a simple gown, elegant but unadorned, precisely the kind of dress she would have chosen regardless of her new status, and Alexander watched her walk toward him with an expression of such open joy that even his sternest relatives found themselves moved to unexpected tears. "I once told you," Eleanor whispered as they stood together before the small gathering, "that I would not be an entry in anyone's ledger. And I promise you," Alexander whispered back, "that you never will be. You are the reason I finally understand what my life was missing, Eleanor. Not a suitable wife, but a true partner, someone who sees me honestly and loves me regardless, someone who taught me that vulnerability is not weakness but the very foundation of genuine happiness." Their vows exchanged, their hands joined before family and friends who had watched their unlikely story unfold from public humiliation to quiet devotion. Alexander and Eleanor began a partnership built on exactly the foundation she had once demanded, and he had once failed to understand: mutual respect earned through patience, honesty offered even when difficult, and love proven through action rather than empty promises. The woman who had once rejected a duke before 300 stunned guests became, in time, the only woman that same duke had ever truly loved, and their story, whispered throughout the county for years afterward, was remembered not for the scandal of its beginning, but for the quiet, hard-earned happiness of its ending. 2 years into their marriage, a letter arrived at Whitmore Hall that threatened to unsettle the peace Eleanor and Alexander had built so carefully together. It came from London, bearing the seal of a distant relation neither of them had met, a cousin on Alexander's mother's side named Lord Reginald Ashby, a man known throughout society for his gambling debts and his willingness to exploit any family connection for personal advantage. The letter requested a substantial loan, framed as a temporary necessity, though the wording carried an unmistakable edge of entitlement, as though Alexander's fortune existed partly for the convenience of relations he barely knew. Alexander read the letter twice at the breakfast table, his expression darkening in a way Eleanor had rarely witnessed since their marriage began. "You seem troubled," she observed, setting aside her own correspondence to study his face carefully. "My cousin Reginald requests a considerable sum," Alexander said, passing her the letter. Not for the first time, though previous requests came through intermediaries rather than his own hand. He suggests, rather pointedly, that family loyalty obligates me to assist him regardless of his own poor judgment in managing his affairs. Eleanor read the letter with growing frustration, recognizing in its careful phrasing the same entitled assumption that had once characterized Alexander's own approach to their courtship before he had learned better. "What will you do?" she asked, curious to see how far he had truly grown from the man who once believed obligation and affection were interchangeable currencies. "I considered, briefly, sending the funds simply to avoid the unpleasantness of refusal," Alexander admitted. "But I find, increasingly, that I have learned something important from you these past years, Eleanor. Generosity given from genuine care differs entirely from generosity extracted through obligation or guilt. I helped your father because I loved you and because his struggle caused you genuine pain. I do not love Reginald, nor does his gambling cause anyone pain beyond his own poor choices. I believe I will decline his request, though I will offer instead to help him find honest employment, should he wish to actually address the source of his difficulties, rather than simply postponing them." Eleanor smiled, pride evident in her expression. "You have grown considerably wiser about the difference between generosity and enabling weakness." "I had an excellent teacher," Alexander replied, reaching across the table to take her hand. The matter with Reginald resolved itself less gracefully than either of them hoped, the cousin responding to Alexander's refusal with several increasingly bitter letters before eventually falling silent altogether, presumably having found some other relation more willing to fund his continued recklessness. Alexander felt no guilt over the decision, and Eleanor's steady support throughout the ordeal only strengthened the partnership they had built, proving that their union could weather disagreement and external pressure without threatening the foundation of trust they had worked so carefully to establish. That autumn brought happier news, when Eleanor discovered she was carrying their first child, a discovery that filled Whitmore Hall with an anticipation neither of them had expected to feel so intensely. Alexander, who had once approached life with careful, guarded composure, found himself unable to contain his joy, insisting on accompanying Eleanor to every appointment with the physician despite his numerous responsibilities managing the estate, and spending long evenings discussing possible names for a child who would not arrive for many months yet. "I want our child to grow up understanding that love is not a transaction," Eleanor said one evening, resting her hand against her gently rounding stomach while they sat together in the library that had witnessed so much of their own courtship. "I want them to know they are loved for exactly who they are, not for what advantage they might bring to this family's name or fortune." "They will know it," Alexander promised, "because they will watch their parents demonstrate it every single day, just as you demonstrated it to me when I had nearly forgotten such a possibility existed." Grace, now approaching her 10th year and thriving under the combined affection of her father, her uncle, and the woman she had long ago stopped calling governess and started calling something closer to family, was overjoyed at the prospect of a new cousin to spoil and instruct in all the important matters of childhood that adults, in her considered opinion, so often overlooked. She visited Whitmore Hall frequently throughout Eleanor's confinement, bringing small gifts and elaborate stories designed to entertain the unborn child, insisting with great seriousness that infants could hear and understand everything said to them, regardless of what the physicians claimed. The child, a daughter they named Margaret after Eleanor's own grandmother, arrived on a bright morning in early summer, her cries filling Whitmore Hall with a sound that Alexander later described as the finest music he had ever heard, finer than any orchestra that had ever played beneath the chandeliers of his grandest balls. He held his daughter for the first time with hands that trembled slightly, overcome by an emotion he had never anticipated feeling with such intensity, and looked up at Eleanor with an expression of pure wonder. "She has your eyes," he said softly, studying the tiny face with rapt attention. "And your stubbornness, I suspect, given how reluctant she was to make her arrival," Eleanor replied, exhausted but radiant, watching her husband cradle their daughter with a tenderness that would have seemed impossible to imagine, had anyone described it to her on that terrible evening in the ballroom years before. As Margaret grew, the household at Whitmore Hall settled into a rhythm of genuine warmth that stood in sharp contrast to the cold formality Alexander had known throughout his own childhood. He made a deliberate effort to be present in ways his own father never had been, kneeling on the nursery floor for games that his own dignity would once have forbidden, reading stories in voices that made Margaret shriek with delighted laughter, learning patience in ways that surprised even himself. Eleanor, meanwhile, found herself increasingly involved in matters beyond the nursery, taking genuine interest in the management of the estate's tenant farms, advocating successfully for improvements to the cottages that housed the families working their land, and establishing a small school for the children of tenant families who otherwise would have received no education whatsoever. Alexander supported every initiative wholeheartedly, recognizing in his wife's efforts the same fierce integrity that had first drawn him to her, now directed toward improving the lives of those who depended on their family's stewardship. "You have changed this household entirely," Lord Edward observed one afternoon, visiting from Ashwood Manor with Grace in tow, watching Eleanor discuss harvest arrangements with the estate steward, with the same confidence she had once brought to defending her own principles in that glittering ballroom years before. "I confess I never imagined my cousin capable of such genuine happiness, Eleanor. You have given him something none of us believed he was permitted to want." "He gave himself permission," Eleanor said, smiling as she watched Alexander across the garden. Margaret perched happily on his shoulders while he pointed out the different varieties of roses their gardener had cultivated. "I merely showed him that the permission existed to be claimed." Years passed in this manner, the family growing to include a second child, a son they named Edmund after Eleanor's father, who had lived to see both grandchildren before passing peacefully in his sleep, secure in the knowledge that his daughter had found not merely security, but genuine happiness beyond anything he had dared hope for her during those anxious months when their family's debt threatened everything they held dear. Whitmore Hall, once known throughout the county for its cold formality and the Duke's careful, distant reserve, became instead a household renowned for its warmth, its genuine welcome to guests of every station, and the evident devotion between its master and mistress that even the most cynical observers found themselves unable to dismiss as mere performance. Eleanor Hartley, who had once stood before 300 guests and refused the greatest match the county had ever witnessed, never once regretted the courage that refusal had required, understanding fully, as the years unfolded before her, that her insistence on being truly seen, rather than merely acquired, had ultimately given her something far more valuable than any title or fortune could have provided on its own. And Alexander Whitmore, watching his wife move through the gardens their daughter had planted, their son trailing behind her with the particular determined stubbornness he had inherited from both his parents in equal measure, understood at last the full truth of what he had learned from the only woman brave enough to reject him, the truth that love, genuine and lasting, could never be purchased, negotiated, or assumed, but only earned, slowly and honestly, one truthful moment at a time.